Now, let us make a transition to an article that I'd like for us to work through. You have perhaps received a reader by email, and the article called The Centrality of the Gospel by Tim Keller. But what I would like us to do now is to get to something a little bit more familiar, I suppose. Perhaps in last week's course, you've done a bit of work around the centrality of the gospel. I want to remind us of some of that material again. And to just outline your day for you today so you can get an idea of where we're going. This morning was this talk on King Jesus as the Savior of the world. And the heading that I would like to try and gather my material under now is, how does the gospel shape the pastor? How does the fact that Jesus is Lord, how does it shape me as a pastor? How does it form me and make me into the kind of pastor that I'm supposed to be? And I'm going to use 3 weapons in my arsenal, if I can say it like that. The first one is this article, The Centrality of the Gospel. And then secondly, I'm going to tell you my own story a little bit, so you get my story. And then if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about sanctification, how the gospel leads to personal sanctification. But we might not get time for that. And then this afternoon, we'll begin with the upper room discourse. And so we'll begin with John 13 this afternoon. Again, a talk on that. And then we'll look at change, a life of change, identifying the idols of the heart, repenting of them, and changing in light of them. So that's what we'll do today. Turning now to that article, The Centrality of the Gospel. By way of introduction, Tim Keller's name, I'm sure you've now grown familiar with his name. I see you have a number of his books on your bookcase at the back there. Tim Keller will become, I think, the go-to author during this part of your training. He was a ferocious reader, which meant that he compiled and summarized much of biblical orthodoxy and shaped it into categories that are very usable for us today. So part of the fact that he was a professor meant that he was also a very good pastor. He knew a lot and he read a lot and therefore could summarize it and package it for pastoral work. I've personally benefited greatly from him, and perhaps some of you have come to know Toby Meyer. He was here a while ago, could be a year ago that he was here. Both Toby and I trained in New York in 2010, and we were there for 6 weeks, and Dr. Timothy Keller trained us in certain modules during that time. And it's one thing to read articles and books by someone. It's quite another thing to see a man in action, to get to know him personally. And I can tell you little stories of this man to help you see how he brings the gospel to bear on the people that he was pastoring. And one little example that a friend of mine recently shared was they were with us at that training course in 2010, and it was he and his wife's wedding anniversary that particular day. And they got into the lift of the block. It was a block of flats like this in Manhattan with offices and flats mixed. And as it happened, the Dr. Timothy Keller was with them in the lift, and he congratulated them on their wedding anniversary. Now, what struck him, my friend, was this was the first time he's ever met this man. He's never met him before. Secondly, no one else knew that it was their wedding anniversary, bar for the fact that he's recently written on his blog. This friend of mine wrote a blog about being married for 5 years. And so it then dawned on him that Tim Keller was reading his blog from time to time. But he didn't stay with the information. It went further into being something of a personal encouragement to this young couple that was there with them. So I want to show you something of a man that then became quite well known in evangelical circles, very influential. He was always very humble and getting to know the people around him. In that way, exemplified what it meant to be a gospel a gospel pastor. And one last anecdote I can share is I visited him in his office, and as we came out of the office, there's like 80 or so people working in the office, just in little booths. And I just come out and I'm a church plant. Our church is like 12 people in central London. We are, I can only dream of having an administrative assistant. And here's 80 people working. And he just put his hands together. He said, I sometimes cannot believe what the Lord has done in our midst by seeing nearly 10,000 people come to the Lord through their ministry there. So by saying that, I want to say, I think we had in our time a remarkable gift that the Lord has given to the church, and we'll be well served in looking over the things that he has learned and taught. And so that's why we'll do some of this. Now, the centrality of the gospel is classic Keller. It is one of the articles that sort of summarizes his thinking, and what he had to bring to the church was really bringing the gold of the past to bear on the church. And the verse that he really helped me to see clearly for the first time is Romans 1 verse 16. I am, says the Apostle Paul, not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation. The power of God for salvation. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, so there's a question. He is not of the gospel. He's not ashamed of the gospel. Why would he be potentially ashamed of the gospel? There's a question. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why? Because it is the power of God. The power of who? Of God. The what of God? The power of God. For what purpose? For salvation. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why? Because it's the power of God for salvation. And so we'll learn that the gospel has power. And it's this power, the ultimate power, that allows eternal souls, we are all eternal souls, to live forever in God's presence. That's what salvation is, an eternal soul that can live forever in God's presence. It is the power of God that allows eternal souls to live forever in the presence of God. Surely that must be ultimate power. But it comes packaged in a cross. And therefore one could potentially be ashamed of it. It comes packaged in an electric chair or in a lethal injection. It comes packaged in a serpent that bites people and they die on a pole. It comes packaged in an unattractive wrapper. But yet it is the power of God for salvation. Now, I am on the first page of that article, The Centrality of the Gospel. And the heading is Part 1, Implications and Applications. Implication number 1, it is the power of God unto salvation. And then he quotes Colossians 1 verse 6 in the second paragraph. He says, all over the world, this gospel is bearing fruit and growing, just as it has been doing among you since the day you heard it and understood God's grace in all its truth. So we now know the gospel is the power of God. But he goes further to show us that this gospel is, the power that it has is the kind of power that is similar to that of a seed. It is power that's in the small package. That means the gospel is a living thing. It itself is alive. And once it's planted, it begins to bear fruit. That's the power of it. It's living, and it bears fruit, and it continues to grow. There is a man called Christian Schwarz. He's a German theologian and statistician. And the view, happens to be my view as well, of the church is that of a plant. And he would say that healthy plants multiply. Healthy plants reproduce. Healthy plants bear fruit. Healthy plants are growing. And so churches, if they want to multiply, if they want to grow, they have to be healthy. And what are the conditions for a church's health is then what he devotes his study on. He does a lot of research, and he comes up with 8 qualities that makes a church healthy, that essentially provides the conditions for growth that takes place. But one thing to note, and I'm not a farmer, but I know farmers, you can have the right conditions. That means you have soil, you can have the right conditions, you have water to water the soil, you can have the right conditions, you have the sun in order to shine, to create the plant to grow. You can have the right conditions in the amount of fertilizer in the soil. But if you do not have the what, you have nothing. You don't have the seed. If you do not have the seed, you have nothing. You just have dirt. It is just dirt. If you do not have the seed, the gospel is incredibly precious. Because it is this gospel. If this is not at the heart of what we do, then brothers, we are wasting our time. There is nothing that can grow. We are watering dirt. We are making the sun shine on dirt. We are putting fertilizer in dirt. But if the seed isn't there, there is nothing. And that's why Paul says the gospel is the power of God. It is a living thing. And then he says it is bearing fruit in Colossians 1:6, bearing fruit and growing. Yes, for the gospel to bear fruit and to grow, it first means it has to be planted in the soil. And then as it is planted, it begins to bear fruit. It begins to bear fruit. How does it begin to bear fruit? As you understood it, since the day you heard it, understood God's grace in all its truth. The gospel is perhaps a simple thing, but it has power that continues to grow and develop as time goes on. We have to work out the implications of the gospel as it's growing day by day. Now, in our back garden, in our little house in London, we had an ivy that grew up on the side of the building, and we had our satellite dish mounted on the back of the house. And because this ivy just grew and grew and grew, at some point it overgrew the satellite dish. And so we couldn't understand why we no longer could find the channels we were looking for and the signal. The gospel has implications. Something has to change. And so in that instance, negatively, I had to get up on a ladder and cut some of the branches off so that the dish can work again. But if the gospel is growing in our hearts, it means that there's going to be changes in the way that we relate to one another as brothers, or to brothers and sisters, or if we're married, to our spouses. There's going to be changes in the way that the gospel is growing, in the way that we relate to our money, to our vocation, to the way that we view our sexuality. And so in all of these things, the gospel, once it comes in, you understand it, it begins to bear fruit. It begins to bring changes that affects everything. And then we learn, thirdly, the gospel continues to grow in us and renews us throughout our lives, as it has been doing since the day you heard it. So the gospel is something that you can hear. It has content, so I can understand it, but then as I understand it, it begins to have its impact, and it begins to change. So the gospel is living, the gospel has to be planted, and the gospel continues to grow, but the growth is based on the truth that you first heard, and the truth that you then begin to apply through its living power. This has massive implications, brothers, for our pastoral work. It means that as I sit down with a brother or sister that is perhaps facing any difficulty, if we took addiction for an example, we can say, I start with the gospel to say that Christ is Lord. You are no longer enslaved to whatever you are addicted to. There is no reason for you to be enslaved anymore. And therefore, this truth that's come into your heart, the person says, yes, I believe that Jesus is Lord. He's seated on the throne, not just of heaven, but also of my heart. And therefore, I'm going to relinquish the power that this sin, this addiction has over my life. I'm going to let go of this power. As they let go of this power, new power, the power of the gospel, begins to come into their lives. They move from an affection for pornography or drugs or work to an affection for Jesus, the one who liberated them. Because it has real living power. Because behind the seed is a real living person that gave himself for us. So that is the power of the gospel. It can change every area of our lives. The second implication of the gospel is its sufficiency. The gospel is not just the ABC of the Christian life. Can anyone finish that sentence? It is the A to Z of the Christian life. I often think of another example. We've just come back from a sea holiday and I watch my children. The south coast of South Africa is known for its wild coastline, and so the waves are particularly wild. There's images recently of a little restaurant that's been in the same spot for the last 30 years, and a freak wave came and washed the entire thing away. Thankfully, no one was hurt in this instance, but the sea is powerful as you look at it. So I see my small daughter, that she's now 10 years old, and she plays in the little waves just as they break. She's in the sea. If you ask her, where are you? She'll say, I'm in the sea. But she's just about that much into the sea. And then my 13-year-old boy, he's also playing in the sea, and the waves that he's in is about that deep. And then you get to my 15-year-old, and he's a bit deeper. My 17-year-old, well, he's behind the waves. And his dad is there praying on the beach that he would make it safely out. You see, the gospel is shallow enough for anyone to walk into, and yet deep enough for the most experienced, mature person to swim in for the rest of their lives. I can't say how overwhelmed I am just in the preparation for these 5 days that we'll spend together, that I even been given 5 days and 20 hours to teach you. I cannot package the gospel in such a neat and simple wrapper and curriculum that we all go away after 5 days of intense study of one topic, applied to one context, that of being a pastor, saying, okay, tick, we now know. No. I'll begin to make a little, just the tip of the tick is going to be made in the next 5 days. And here I am, 45 years old, 17 years in ministry, and I feel I've grown a little bit in that, but I've just touched the surface. So the gospel really is, yes, the first steps, but it becomes a sea for you to swim in as life continues. Now, the gospel, as you've heard, I'm sure, until now, is that you are not justified by your religion or by your obedience, but you are justified through the finished work of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so the trouble is that we often fall, when we think about the sufficiency of the gospel, we go away from the gospel is all we need, to we need the gospel and we need incredible rationalism. We need to have these clear arguments. We have to have this clear structure. We need to know these things point by point by point by point. Brothers, if you asked, I think it was John Frame, who's a theologian, you might see one of his books on your rack here, he said, if you could summarize your theological studies, your 40 years of teaching theology, we give you the microphone now and you will summarize your theology for us. He says, Jesus loves me, this I know, because the Bible tells me so. It's a little children's rhyme. And here's this major theologian, after all of his studies, being devoted to it, having written, I think, 16 books on these subjects. It's this simple faith that Jesus loves me and the Bible tells me about this that forms the basis of his faith and of his gospel understanding. And so it is not the gospel and something else. It's not the gospel and academics, the gospel and obedience, the gospel and legalism, the gospel and a religion that leads to my justification. Those things are useful, they have their use, but they're of no use for my salvation. for my justification. And this is an important difference that we need to make. In saying that the gospel is sufficient, it is sufficient for what? It's sufficient for our salvation. But the gospel applied to academics, the gospel applied to our religion, the gospel applied to our education becomes a life-giving force in our lives, not just for our benefit, but also for the benefit of non-Christians. So the gospel is sufficient. Now there's a quote in there by Richard Lovelace, and the quote, well, no, it's not direct. He says that most people's problems are just a failure to be oriented to the gospel, a failure to grasp and believe it through and through. So what happens, and I've experienced this in my own life, where I know the gospel, I know that Jesus is Lord, I know that I've been justified for Christ's finished work on the cross, but somehow I live with another truth. I essentially, I read the Bible and I live my life as if Jesus is not Lord. And so I am not oriented to the gospel as the lens through which I look at the world. Now I see the way that you make coffee. Well, you make coffee here through a cafetiere like this. That means you can put hot water in, or you put your coffee in and then the hot water, and then you separate the beans from the coffee and you get the delicious coffee flavor in the water because you've pressed the coffee out. But there's another way that you can make coffee, and that is with an espresso machine. And I know you think you know how this works. So you boil water in a boiler, it puts the water under pressure, and then in the group head, you put your coffee, your coffee grounds in the group head, you tighten it, and then the hot water gets pressed through that head, and out comes the delicious extracted coffee in your cup. Oh, just the right thing. But if the gospel is missing in our lives, it is similar to a man trying to make coffee with an espresso machine without putting any coffee beans in the group head. He puts the machine on, the hot water is boiling, he opens it, and he just pushes pressurized hot water through a group head, and out comes warm water. That's all. If the gospel is not the lens through which you look at the world, if the gospel is not the coffee through which the water is filtered, there is no power. And Martin Luther would say, the truth of the gospel is the principal article of all Christian doctrine. Most necessary is it that we know this article well, teach it to others, and beat it into their heads continually. So I would love to come and visit your church in the years ahead, and then you have as your slogan, "Here we beat the gospel into your head." Please don't do that. But you must understand that it is a continual return to the gospel that unleashes the power of God unto salvation in the life of your church. And I hope to discover with you how we can keep the gospel central in everything that we do. Now, Keller points out that there are two thieves to this gospel. Two thieves to this gospel. Who would like to name? It's got various names that he gives them. Who can name some of those thieves to this gospel? Moralism. Moralism is on the one side. Moralism, we'll try and understand what that means in a minute. And then with the counterpart to moralism is perhaps hedonism. So moralism says, here is the gospel. You're accepted, you are loved because God has placed His love on you. God has done it. God has done it all. God has loved you. That's the gospel. He died for you, paid for you. You are His and He is yours, and you are free and liberated for all eternity. And then the one thief that seeks to rob this truth away from you comes along and says, moralism. No, you have to be good first. The whole Christ, right? There we go with Sinclair Ferguson to say, no, the alcoholic first has to stop his alcoholism before we can say he is saved by the gospel. He first has to clean up his life before we can say he's saved by the gospel. And that is a thief. And it's a thief that's vibrant and alive in the life of Christianity, broadly speaking. And as pastors, this will be your main job, is to be able to say to sinners that feel that they cannot come into God's presence because of the dirt in their lives, to say, no, you're welcome. And to say to saints that look like they're saints on the outside, that you are also welcome in spite of your less than perfect record. You'll have a constant job to say to Christians that this drug addict is welcome in our midst because of the gospel. And you'll have a constant job to say to a moralistic Christian that it is not your good deeds and therefore your bad deeds that disqualify you from knowing God's presence. So this is a thief, moralism. And then on the other side, the other thief is hedonism. Hedonism means I live a life that is completely surrendered to my desires. I do what I want. I want to do what I want, and God will forgive. God will forgive. I can live my life, but God is love. God will forgive. I don't have to care about a life of obedience or a life of morality, because God will forgive. And so people are licentious. They do whatever they want and whatever they like. And so the gospel is that you're saved through grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, not through your morality and in spite of your hedonism. You can also call this pair legalism. People say, here's a list of laws by which you can be saved. Or on the other side, relativism. Oh, it's all relative. Let's not worry about the rules. God is not interested in the rules. The gospel is something completely different. It is not a middle way between these two. It is a third way. It's a new way. That is neither this one nor that one, but a new way. So we can see that the gospel is able to bring both truth and grace together. The truth that because of Christ's obedience, his legalism, you are saved. But it's not just his truth that saves you, it's also his grace. It's in spite of your law breaking that he saves you. So the moralism religion thief, how does it steal your joy and power? The moralism and religious thief, how does it steal your joy and power? Can you see what it immediately says? It says that there is joy and power in following the gospel way. There is joy because there is salvation, and there is power because we know the gospel is unto salvation. There's joy and power in the gospel. If you live in the gospel, there's joy and power, but then there is this thief that is ready to rob it away from you, and he does that primarily by saying to you that you are not good enough. You are not good enough. You can never live up to the standards that God has placed. And so you constantly feel guilty. And then perhaps because you feel guilty, you begin to cover your guilt through lies by representing yourself in a way that is not true to who you are. You try to pretend to be better than what you actually are. You inflate yourself. Now this is incredibly powerful, brothers. If I can just talk you through briefly, I could potentially draw this, of the addictive cycle. So you can see how the moralistic religion thief comes to steal power and joy. If you think of a person's, you said double tap. Well, I'm not good enough for the double tap. Oh, there we go. If we said, here is a circle in someone's life, and all of us, because of the fall, are inclined to sin and evil. So we've got our believer, our Christian man over here, and he lives a life between these two thieves on the one side and the other side. He lives his life between the thief of moralism, say you're not good enough, and hedonism that says, oh, you can do whatever you please. And he's constantly trying to recenter in the gospel, say, no, I'm accepted because God loves me. God is the one who drives my salvation forward. When life happens, a trigger event happens. Let's say he is particularly tempted, and I'll use an example like sexual sin. Tempted to sexual sin. What happens immediately, he gets tempted by sexual sin, and the question is, will he give in to the sin or not? Now, the gospel is the power and the joy of God. If he stays in the gospel, he will not commit to the sin. But what happens is, because we're frail human beings, sin, this event takes place here. I see something that tempts me right there. And now I start to fantasize about it. I start to fantasize about the sin. But what happens as I fantasize about this sin, something happens in my moralistic heart. I begin to feel guilty, almost already a little bit ashamed because of what it is that I'm even thinking about doing. Because I do not return back to the gospel that is the power unto salvation, but I stay in this place of sin, I finally, the pressure, the guilt of this sin wears me down because I don't go back to the gospel. Moralism breaks me down. And then finally, I give into it. I give into this sin. Whatever this bad sin might be, I give into it. Now I've committed this sexual sin. In the world of sexual sin, you've clicked on the website, you've now looked at the pictures, and now it's all done. And what do you feel like when all of that is done? You feel even lower than low. Lower than low. And in this position of despair, you're more susceptible than you would ever know to commit the same sin again. Why? Because you feel so incredibly low. You feel so incredibly low. There is just lowness in you. There is nothing. And you think, what can take me out of this pit of guilt and shame? How can I escape this cycle of sin? I saw something, I started to fantasize about it, I gave into it, and now I'm in this dump of dumps. I start to hide. I start to hide from friends. So either I lock myself in and I don't speak about the sin, or I speak about the sin, but I don't speak about it in real terms. I don't say what I've actually done or what's actually going on in my life. And so life begins to carry on again. I pretend to be a man that lives in the gospel, and a new trigger event takes place. And I feel guilty again, and I repeat it again and again and again. But the gospel comes right into the heart of this picture. And it says, God knows you. God knows you through and through. Both your moralistic self that will feel guilty because you have sinned, and your devious heart that can come up with all kinds of desires. God knows it all. And He loves you in the midst of it. And if you come back to this love at any point during this cycle, you escape the consequences. At any point, if you come back to this gospel, you are free from the thief that seeks to steal or rob your joy or your power. And later on, we will see that it is the work of the Christian community, of fellowship around us, that brings the gospel to bear on a heart that is prone to fall off the horse on the left-hand side, moralism, or fall off the horse on the right-hand side, hedonism. It is the gospel that centers us, that brings us right back into the middle. In this moralistic mindset, what you find, and it's often a big surprise, we've had a terrible scandal in the UK where a very well-known theologian was found to have lived a double life and very sadly, desperately committed suicide at the end of his life. First failed in his attempt and then succeeded the second time around once his sexual sin was exposed. And he was in a very moralistic environment, and he was in a very moralistic mindset himself. And so he had to present an image of being someone that he wasn't. There just wasn't room in that Christian community to put his hand up and say, I am prone to the most wickedest and evilest of sin. I first should not be an elder or a pastor in the church. I should sit under the word. I should not lead the church. I'm here because I've given in to this sin and that sin in my life. I'm here to hear the gospel afresh for my life. Please lead me. Please teach me. Please pastor me back to the gospel. But unfortunately, in a moralistic environment, he had to inflate himself. He had to pretend to be someone that he wasn't. And a double life developed that was unsustainable in the end. The relativism or irreligion thief. Let's look at that one. It is what we find in liberal religion. It is the phrase, God is love, and that God's love for mankind cost him nothing. God's grace is free, but it's not cheap, we would say. It's free. God does love, but it is not relative. People in this particular mindset do not believe that God punishes or judges those that sin against him. And so their view of who God is not as a loving father, an actual person that loves his creatures, that loved them enough to die for them. But their view is that God is an idea, almost an impersonal force, that God is love. The idea that God is, everything that's loving is God. And therefore anything goes. Anything that you want to do really goes. Nothing is bad. Nothing is to be judged. And so we must see in ourselves one of each of these. Because when I sin in this cycle of sin, I would like to believe at times that God is not a judge. I would like to believe that God is love. I would like to just believe that, oh, you know what, I've now committed this sin, but God is love. God will forgive. That's fine. Let me just carry on with life. Let me just plaster over what I've done or thought or said. God is love. I like to believe that. But that is not the gospel. It doesn't lead to joy or power, because it pretends or it makes God into what he is not. And so I lose sight of God's holiness. And so God is no longer who he is, the holy God. God has now been changed into an impersonal force that is just love, that just plasters over my sin. That is what I can do if I'm a relativist, but it's also what I can do if I'm a moralist. A moralist can do the very same thing. And to just create God into this angry judge with his pointed finger, forgetting that God is love. And so therefore God becomes something he isn't. He is just an angry finger. And when I sin, I just see his pointed finger at me and I feel shame and guilt and I shrink away and I hide from him and I hide from others. And that is not who God is, because God is love. So he draws me out of my sin because he is more merciful than I would know. So we distort who God is when you're a moralist or when you're a hedonist. Well, we lose the joy and the power of grace. We lose it because we don't see that God is forgiving, but we don't see that I can forgive myself. So I tend to believe that God must forgive my sin, but because I'm a moralist, I don't go far enough to think that God's forgiveness runs all the way through. Because when he died on the cross, he died for each and every sin that I've ever committed. And therefore I can turn to him wholeheartedly, and I can also forgive myself. And therefore I begin to distort his grace into be something that it isn't. And it leads to all kinds of ways that we should not live. The trouble is, when we begin to see God's grace and God's power in a way other than what the gospel presents it, we start to live a life that is not in line with the gospel. And perhaps you remember that section in Galatians 2 where Peter is siding with the Jews. So he's hanging out only with the Jews, and Paul comes to visit in Galatia, and he says to Peter in front of the others that he should return to the truth of the gospel. That's Galatians 2 verse 14. Because this line of the gospel is one that has to be traversed. It has to be held right at the center. We constantly have to come back to it. Here's Peter that has experienced everything that is experienced, and he suddenly becomes a racist. Here's Peter that has had the dream of the clean and unclean animals, and God says you can eat them all. And here all of a sudden he becomes a racist. He says there is the sacred and the not sacred. And he starts to act in a way that is not in line with the gospel. So Paul has to bring him back to the gospel. And so let us work with a few of these headings. Can I get you to look at part 2, the key to everything, the gospel and the individual? And we're not going to deal with all. There's nearly 14 of them. Let me just ask if you want to talk about one of them in particular. I've got one that I want to talk about. The headings are the gospel and the individual. How do you approach discouragement? How do you approach the physical world? How do you approach love and relationships? How do you approach suffering? How do you approach sexuality? How do you approach your family? Self-control? How to witness? Human authority, human dignity. How do you approach guilt? Number 11 on the list says the approach to guilt, and it might fit with your question. He says, when you say, I can't forgive myself, it means there is some standard or condition or person that is more central to your identity than the grace of God. If you cannot forgive yourself, it is because you have failed your real God, which is your real righteousness, and it is holding you captive. The moralist's false God is usually a God of their imagination that is holy and demanding but not gracious. The relativist's God is usually some achievement or relationship. God is the only God who forgives. No other God will. And so either God is a just judge or he is the merciful forgiver. But the real God is both. And that is, of course, what we see in the gospel. Jesus Christ comes to die on an actual cross with his actual body, giving his actual blood to fulfill all the just requirements of God, because God is a just judge with his finger pointed at sin. But God is willing to do it. He gives his life in the Son because he is gracious and merciful. Because God is both grace and truth, both justice and love. And so we easily, individually, make God either into the one or into the other. What else came to mind that you wanted to talk about? Number 7. 13. Yeah, I love that one. That's a good one. Approach to joy and humor. Moralism eats away at joy and humor because the system of legalism forces you to take yourself, your image, your appearance, your reputation too seriously. Relativism, on the other hand, will tend towards cynicism as life goes on. This cynicism grows from a lack of hope for the world. In the end, evil will triumph. There is no judgment or divine justice. But if we are saved by grace alone, then the very fact of being Christian is a constant source of amazed delight for us. There is nothing matter-of-fact about our lives. No, of course, to our lives. It's a miracle that we're Christians, and we have hope. So the gospel that creates bold humility should give us a deep sense of humor. We don't have to take ourselves seriously, and we're full of hope in the world. Can you think of a Bible verse that goes with that one? The Lord in heaven laughs. I'm trying to remember where that now is. Psalm 2, right? He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Now, only the Lord can be in that position of doing that, but there should be a lightness to us as we go through the world that we're in. A constant sense of amazement of all that God has given, the givenness of your Christian life. No one can make themselves a Christian. You are made a Christian. God chooses you. He gives you the gospel. Now, either either, he gives you the gospel, you become a follower of Jesus, and then for the rest of your life, you just stand in amazement that he allows you to live a life whilst knowing him in all that you do. Nothing that I've done, I've attained, so I can't say, but I've worked hard for my things, and you better not touch my stuff. Everything you have is from him, so you can have an open hand. And so I can tell you a brief story. We were looking at a house to buy in Johannesburg, and all the houses we go and look at, high fences, electric fences, and gates and everything. And I think this is still necessary, but this man, we went to look at his house. He has none of this. He's got the low fence. He's got a beautiful old house. It needs a lot of work. And we walk around. I said to him, I see you have no fence here. Why do you not? Your neighbors, everyone has electric fences. He said, Kruger, if someone is so desperate that they need to break into your house to steal, they're in a desperate situation. And everything that I have has been given to me anyway. So I'll invite them in and I'll say, come sit down. If they happen to burgle me when it's dinner time, I'll invite them for food first to say, and then go ahead, take whatever you want because it's not mine anyway. Now, it's kind of funny when I tell the story, but I tell you, when I stood there with the man whilst he was sharing it with me, I realized he actually means this. He actually means this, that he's a Christian, his whole life is just open like that. And he is just, everything I have is the Lord's. And so there's a lightness to him, as opposed to the other people's homes that we go and look at, and they're fearful. We ring the doorbell, we wait, and they look through the thing first, and then come in, and we have to be with the agent, and the agent has us to sign something, and we have to be identity. We can't walk into the room with someone looking over our shoulder. You constantly have this feeling that this person is saying, I've worked for what I have, and you better not touch my stuff. So how do you want to live? I'd rather be poor in the gospel, open-handed, than clasping and grasping and closed-fisted, and rather laughing with joy in life than constantly be counting and measuring and weighing. Let's carry on. We've got time for two more. What else is there? Another one that caught your eye from this list? If not, let us go on then to the next heading, and it's the gospel and the church. And there we have 8 points. Approach to ministry in the world. Number 1, approach to worship. Number 2, approach to the poor. Number 3, approach to doctrinal distinctives. In number 4, approach to holiness. Approach to miracles in number 6, approach to church health, number 7, and approach to social change in number 8. I'd be keen to revisit the approach to miracles just to see, since we've been talking about celestial beings and so on, why don't we read the 6th one? Is there anyone that would like to read that one for us out loud if they have it in front of them? It's a difficult balance to strike, and to some of the questions we've had earlier, the already of the kingdom of God and the not yet fully part of the kingdom means that we are living in this overlap in the relay race, where we're not yet fully in Revelation 21, where there's no disease and no tears and no suffering. But we are already there to some very real sense. But the not yet means that we are at this moment still struggling. And so as you read the letters to the church in the book of Revelation, it is to the 7 churches that are suffering. They are suffering and having difficulty. And so God is, of course, completely at liberty to take all of the suffering away in an instant for his church. And sometimes extraordinarily he does that. I've experienced in my own life, and I hope you can give testimony of the same. But normally, God gives us the faith to preserve or persevere in the midst of suffering and trials and difficulty, with our eyes fixed on the full consummation of the kingdom, where there will be no tears and no suffering. So a church that is governed by this gospel perspective means that if someone in church is suffering, we're not sitting with them saying, your faith has failed you. You have not prayed enough. It's because you've not given enough money. It is because you've not done this, you've not done that. We can't say that because God is at liberty to give and take what He wants and what He pleases. But in the same way, we also don't build a church that says, no, it's just suffering all the time. The church will just suffer. In this age, we will just suffer. Jesus is Lord. And He extraordinarily protects His church in the midst of all kinds of trials that takes place. And therefore, you'll see the academic assignment that I've given you is hard work, brothers. It's hard work and hard work, because it's asking the question, how can you be fruitful in the midst of adversity, in the midst of difficulty? Because as a Christian minister, you will experience a sort of adversity that if God was a God that can take suffering away in an instant, and He did that all the time, our jobs would have been wonderful and easy. But now our jobs as pastors are to sit with the weak and the suffering, and to be ourselves the weak and the suffering, yet with our eyes fixed on Christ, yet praying and asking Him to relieve our suffering and to bring freedom and liberty. And so, have an eye on that one. God can do miracles and still does them, but in the normal course, we're also exposed to real suffering. Approach to holiness. The Gospels already means we should not tolerate sin. So I guess this is going to speak to the whole of Christ that you've been reading. With the presence of the kingdom, we are made partakers of the divine nature. 2 Peter 1:4. The gospel brings us the confidence that anyone can be changed. Any enslaving habit can be overcome. But the gospel not yet means that our sin remains in us and will never be eliminated until the fullness of the kingdom comes. So we must avoid pat answers. We must not expect quick fixes. Unlike moralists, we must be patient with slow growth or lapses, and be aware of the complexity of change and growth in grace. Unlike pragmatists and cynics, we must insist that miraculous change is possible. It's just a wonderful vision of what it means to be a follower of Christ. We all long to be built up into the maturity of Christ, and that means to be as loving as Christ is and to be as gentle as Christ is, but it also means to be as holy as Christ is. And that's why one of the requirements for an elder in God's church is that they are held in high esteem by neighbors, both in and outside of the church. These are people that are known for their holiness. But yet this holiness is not attained like that, like in a miracle. It's through patient and slow growth that we seek it. And we cannot eliminate the slow and hard work of being shaped into mature, holy men in God's service without the path of suffering and adversity. It's still, for me, a very complicated verse where it says, Christ was made perfect through suffering. I don't know if you've come across that verse. And I've not prepared to even think about it out loud, but it's a verse to go think about. Why did Christ have to go through suffering? And to what extent was He made perfect? What is meant by His perfection there? I don't have answers to those questions, but here's the one answer I definitely have, and that is that Christ, the Son of God, suffered. And who am I then to expect a life of ease and life of comfort if He suffered? So we must be prepared for greater fruitfulness through suffering, to be made more holy through suffering. Again, an example from a farmer. Some trees are more fruitful when they are pruned. So you prune them, and the pruning is not easy. Some have even made the connection in the Old Testament that The fruitfulness of Israel came as a result of the pruning of Abraham, and that is circumcision. Dare not to think about that. But in a very real sense, Israel becomes a very large nation because they've been pruned, and there's some real suffering there for us men to think about. But through suffering, there is fruitfulness. So expect suffering, is what I would say to you as young pastors. And be prepared for suffering, not then to pray, God, please just take it away from me, but to say, God, please make me more holy through the suffering. Make me more like your Son through the suffering. And do not let me despise the suffering that you've brought across my path, but let me thank you for it, hoping and praying that you'll make me more like your Son.